Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special live coverage on Al24 News, where we will follow up the latest regarding the Russian-Ukrainian thorny file right after this break. Welcome back, and we start with several Ukrainian cities which have reported deaths and widespread damage as the two sides prepare for a third round of peace talks expected today, Monday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged the West to strengthen sanctions on Russia. UK Home Secretary Priti Patel called on the International Criminal Police Organization Interpol to suspend Russia from its systems on Sunday, arguing that Moscow poses a direct threat to international law enforcement. And finally, gas prices in Europe skyrocketed on Monday, reaching over $3,600 per 1,000 cubic meters for the first time in history. Still with the same story, the Russian military operation in Ukraine resulted in Russian using different military equipment to cement their operation using missiles carried by Russian warplanes, caliber cruise missiles and rocket and artillery bombardments, which both outweigh in modernity and effectiveness comparing the equipment Ukraine is using to retaliate, which also consists of anti-armor missiles, Soviet-era Tochka U short-range ballistic missiles and US-made Javelin anti-tank missiles. And to discuss further, I'm joined live by Hamoud Sarhi from the United States, Associate Dean Professor. Well, welcome, Hamoud, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. In the beginning, Hamoud, I start with you. How can you read the Russian advancement onto the Ukrainian territories, taking into consideration that it is the 12th day of this military operation amid stiff resistance from Ukrainians?
It's been difficult and as expected, despite the fact that many thought or made believe that the Russians have miscalculated, which is strong. One could make a strong case for that. But it is part of the war, and I think the way things are moving, they are within the Russians are facing difficulty, are facing challenges from inside and outside, and so at this perspective, there is still not clear what's the next step. There are diplomatic initiatives on the side, and there are also military operations inside. So it is the same problems that the Russians have faced, which is resistance from within, and also a global reaction that is affecting them as well.
Hamoud, let me just ask you this question. Don't you think that Russia has deceived the world by the number of its military equipment, since it's taken this time in order at least to advance into the Ukrainian capital, Kiev?
You could make that case, but it's also part of the propaganda machine, and this is how the war, is narrated in the public as in the media. On the reality, it's a different ground. There are obstacles. The EU looking at a huge area to cover. You're looking at strategic responses by other countries. So the value of the total number of the Russian soldiers or the Russian army and military that is found that has been sent to Ukraine is overwhelming in many cases, but it has to be put in that perspective. The media propaganda that is designed to project the idea that there is a stiff resistance. which is in this case seen on many levels, because we're talking about the sovereignty of state, we're talking about changing the displacement of the lives of people, and we're talking about a war that has a major implication on the lives of many. So that has to be taken with a grain of salt. That large number of troops doesn't translate automatically to winning. What the difference that we've seen from the previous conflict back in 2014 is that you have a world inside resistance on the one hand, and the other thing, the plan that the Russians have to be is bigger than it was before. We're talking about taking over a major strategic location, regime change, and a U.S. administration that seems to be very keen on making on resisting and forcing the Russians to stop what is to them an invasion.
Let me just bring into our conversation Adam Ben Said, who joins us live via Skype from Turkey and is actually an investigative journalist. Well, there are some media reports, Adam, that says that the military equipment that Russia is currently using in this operation just belong to the Soviet Union era. These are not actually new equipment. What do you think about this?
I think that's very difficult to prove for the reason that Russia, being the continuation of the Soviet Union politically, would naturally have high amounts of Soviet-era stock weaponry. Ukraine, Albania, this is the same case for them. So I don't really see that the Soviet element really is a big deal. However, it is very clear that Putin is playing along possibly neo-Soviet lines. He's hell-bent on a military conquest, it seems. And it doesn't seem like negotiations are going to make a difference in that. But in terms of weaponry, I would say that Russia is quite well stocked. It's not necessarily Soviet. They're using modern weaponry, AK-74s instead of 47s, and quite a new array of light armored vehicles and tanks. Yeah, essentially that's it.
All right, let's move on and just follow this report about Russian Defense Ministry stated that its troops deployed in this military operation on the Ukrainian territories will stop fire at 10 a.m. in an attempt to apply the ceasefire that was agreed upon with Ukrainian negotiators. Russia has announced that firing will stop to give more freedom for civilians to evacuate cities in humanitarian corridors.
Сегодня, 5 марта,
Even as Russia announced the ceasefire starting Monday morning and the opening of humanitarian corridors in several areas, Ukrainian officials stated that Russian armed forces continued to pummel Ukrainian cities with multiple rocket launchers hitting residential buildings. The limited ceasefire announcement came a day after hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians attempting to flee to safety were forced to shelter from Russian shelling of cities in Ukraine's center, north and south. Officials from both sides planned a third round of talks Monday.
Russia started bombarding the city of Volnovakha with heavy weapons. As you know, from 9 a.m. on Saturday, March 5th, we had a preliminary agreement to open 2 humanitarian corridors in Volnovakha and Mariupol. I note that Russia has violated the agreements made even with the Red Cross and is bombing the city of Volnovakha. There is also fighting in the direction of Mariupol-Zaporozhye, which prevents movement from Mariupol to Zaporozhye.
Earlier on Monday, the Russian Defense Ministry said it would halt the ongoing firing in Ukraine to open 6 humanitarian corridors in the country under siege. Civilians from Kharkiv, Kiev, Mariupol and Sumy can leave today after French President Emmanuel Macron's personal request to his Russian counterpart. Ukraine's General Staff said Monday morning that Russian forces continued the military operation, opening fire on the city of Mykolaiv, 480 kilometers south of the capital Kiev. Rescuers said they were putting out fires in residential areas caused by rocket attacks. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky had warned Russia on Sunday night and said his country will punish everyone who committed atrocities in this country. It came hours after 8 Ukrainian civilians were killed as they attempted to flee a suburb of Ukraine capital Kiev.
Well, I go back to you, Hamoud. Don't you think that this ceasefire, if applied and respected by both sides, is still contradictory to the continuous Russian military operation this morning in different parts of Ukraine?
So again, what you have on the scene is that you have this kind of discussions or talk like during conflicts like this. So the discussions that are going on most likely are focusing on what is happening on the battle, finding, for example, a compromise on passages, corridors, humanitarian assistance. This fits well within with the international discourse and international law. So what the Russians are trying to do is conduct this war within the limitations or within the international law and wars principles, if there is such wars, such principles. The idea here is that you have a track about the ceasefire to provide assistance for the civilians, for the victims, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you have other tracks that are going on. Diplomatic initiative, for example, by Britain, by the EU, by the latest is perhaps mediation by Turkey. These are sort of going in line with what's happening. So in many ways, the purpose of the discussion at this time, these talks between the Russian and the Ukrainian delegations are to find ways of how to implement the war's principles of conducting wars at the same time, maintaining
Don't you think, Hamoud, sorry to cut you here and just ask you simply, because what's happening this morning and even yesterday, what is really should be applied in this case is that the Russian part or both sides, they put down the guns and they just head for negotiations and help these civilians to, move into these humanitarian corridors. But what we have noticed, at least when we note here and talk about the city of Erbil, it has just witnessed, a lot of military operation, and civilians got stuck in it.
I'm not denying that. Or what the reporters are suggesting is that there is a lack of sort of respect for what was discussed, that there are that the civilians are being hit. All that sort of add to the whole conduct of war. Or in this case, one could make the case that the Russians are not negotiating in good faith, or that they don't have control. The leadership that is doing negotiations doesn't have control over people on the field, or the message has not gotten. But the point is that there are always ways of going around this kind of negotiation or agreements on the ground. So whether we give them credibility is another issue. Whether they respect them is another issue. There are so many factors that are in their play, and sometimes, the ceasefire, the agreements that are reached, are also used, perhaps in this case as well, to take advantage on the ground for the purpose of winning the war, or at least winning partially a battle or another.
Mm-hmm. Well, I put this to you, Adam, as well. Talking about the ceasefire that was supposed to take place at 10 a.m. this morning, the Ukrainian authorities were waiting actually for the Russian side to stop firing and their military operation in some particular places on the Ukrainian grounds. In a very simple question, who do you think that Russia could listen to? Who could stop Russia from using the guns and apply the ceasefire?
I think the international community can, and they have been. Arguably, the third return to the ceasefire by Russia is an attempt to sort of avoid the perception of dealing in bad faith, which can have significant consequences down the line, especially in terms of uncontrolled escalation and mistrust. But there is no specific country. I'll give you an example. Turkey is quite close to Russia, maintains good diplomatic ties. In the conversation between Putin and Erdogan, Putin emphasized that the war would not be over until Kiev conceded to all Russian demands, which are primarily military. There's 95% Russian soldiers within Ukraine out of the amount that was built up on the border. It doesn't seem to me like this is, there is anybody they can listen to now. It does seem like, for better or for worse, that they're sort of stalling for time as they consolidate military objectives in the country. These ceasefires have not been executed effectively. As to why, that remains to be seen. There's not much detail going on. There have been civilian deaths. Humanitarian corridors are incredibly risky in terms of if they're not protected corridors, you have massive danger of civilian mortality and deaths. Russia doesn't seem to be prioritizing this right now, again, as I said, because they have military objectives, but they do have to offset the international community's perception, which is going to go the longest way towards reining in its behavior.
But why is it taking all of this time in order to reach its targets and objectives in Ukraine? Adam?
Well, the international community did mobilize rather significantly, even if a little late, so that definitely had an effect. But the Ukrainian air defenses and radar installations are mostly in effect. We saw a downed Russian helicopter. Without control of the skies, movement on the ground is it's slow. You could say there's a 1 mile column, armored column outside of Kiev that hasn't entered for some time. I think they're trying to consolidate the majority of their gains in the rest of the country, but it remains to be seen as to what the actual issue is and why they're taking so long. There is an element of trying to play up public hysteria, in my personal opinion. It's sort of a playbook that has been used in Crimea, and if the ultimate goal is to change government, mass panic certainly helps with that sort of thing before a foreign body like Russia can come and intervene and offer order, at least within the international discourse, the narrative that is being presented.
Let's see and talk later, probably with you again, Adam, about the atmosphere in which these negotiations are taking place. The two delegations from Ukraine and Russia are expected to meet for a third round of negotiations, which both sides had said could take place today, Monday. A member of the Ukrainian delegation to talks with Russia, servant of the People Party lawmaker David Arkamia, said that the next round will be held on the Polish-Belarusian border as the previous one. Well, back to you, Adam. How do you assess the atmosphere in which these negotiations of today, likely talks, are taking place? Sorry, Adam, can you just make sure that...
Yesterday was a religious holiday,
Okay, thank you.
religious holy day within Ukraine, one of quite significance to do with mercy and so forth. I don't think this has much weight on Russian military and political planning. They do have political and military objectives that they're trying to reach. It's not so much a stake of Russia versus Ukraine as much as it is the Western world order, as some would have you believe, versus Russian long-term security. So the stakes are quite high. In terms of the upcoming round of negotiations, I haven't seen anything to say that this will be different from the previous rounds, although the pressure from the international community is mounting considering the escalating humanitarian crisis. But we haven't really seen any signals of or signs of a willingness to resolve the issue. I think that requires a significant amount of political will or political fatigue. And it doesn't seem that Russia has hit its limits yet, in spite of the economic sanctions and in spite of the sort of international pressure. Now, I will say one thing, that the sort of bilateral communication that's happening right now, and even the multilateral diplomatic groups that are being convened by third parties, really lack the force of weight when it comes to Russia. Russia's sort of playing along with them as part of a process, as practitioners of international relations will know. Probably the solution will be found as they continue down this process, and countries are really committed to finding a non-violent resolution to this ongoing issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. You just stay with us. And now we move to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who continues his visit to European countries, where he works to coordinate a Western response to the current crisis in Ukraine. Nabil Khazini.
Heading to Europe, the center of the conflict, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken started the tour, and in his agenda, a continuation of extensive consultations and coordination with the U.S. NATO allies and European partners to tackle the security issue in Ukraine. Today, he arrived in Lithuania, where he reaffirmed the U.S. pledge to defend NATO allies.
The United States, with all allies and partners, will defend every inch of NATO territory should it come under attack, and there should be no doubt about that.
Few days ago, NATO has rejected Kiev's appeal for a no-fly zone, and the alliance has firmly announced that it cannot intervene in Ukraine.
We are not part of this conflict, and we have a responsibility to ensure it does not escalate and spread beyond Ukraine.
As another alternative to provide Ukraine with the help the country constantly asked for, Antony Blinken announced the United States is working on a deal with Poland to send planes to Ukraine.
With Ukrainian officials, with the government, President Zelensky, Foreign Minister Kuleba, I saw yesterday, and others, to get an up-to-the-minute assessment of their needs. And as we get that assessment, we're working on seeing what we and allies and partners can deliver.
The series of U.S. Secretary of State's visit in Europe will continue tomorrow. Antony Blinken will be in Estonia and in France to meet Emmanuel Macron in the evening to continue coordinating the Western response to the situation in Ukraine.
Well, back to you, Hamoud. Don't you think that the USA is in fact fueling the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? It's clearly saying it that I don't go into a direct war with Russia, but I send my troops, I send my equipment, I send some mercenaries here and there on the borders into Ukraine and don't intervene myself with a direct conflict with Russia.
And there is a reason for it. The main reason is the United States doesn't want to get into conflict with anywhere or any shape with in the Ukraine. And that's what the public opinion in the United States, the majority, they don't want to deal with this issue at all. There is no any other condition. Connected to that, there is a strong pressure, internal pressure in the United States to find a solution to the high or the increase in oil prices. This is what the United States today, or the Biden administration's biggest headache. Within the United States, discussion and media reports about how the oil prices are going higher and higher. And we start to see images and reports about the effect of oil prices in regions that are heavily democratic, showing that the prices are at a point where they are uncontrollable. And it becomes, even in public, in the streets, people are really are upset, and because it touches their pockets. So that's the main problem for the United States. And from that perspective,
Hamoud, people are reading the news, are following the numbers, the statistics.
Are following what? I'm sorry.
People actually are following the media, are following the news, what's streaming on social media about the numbers of troops, the number of mercenaries, or the military equipment that the USA is actually handling to Ukraine.
But the way it's presented, the narrative, what the American public is receiving, American public doesn't care that much about how much the United States is involved internationally. In other words, we've seen demonstration when the war in Iraq, the war protest movements, all of that were huge. But there is nothing has impacted or is impacting the position of the United States like the impact that the oil prices have gone. This is not gone by $1 or $2. It has increased substantially, and it comes on the eve of inflation, higher prices. all of this is the driving factor today. So there is talk about a drill in the United States, discussion that is always controversial. There is talk about alternative energy, and there is talk about looking at this president as villain, because at one point, before this surge of oil prices, Biden, in the public opinion, started to do better. So there is that internal factor that is driving the American foreign policy, and the U.S. at this point wants a resolution to this conflict as soon as possible, and projecting the idea by strength that they are standing up to Putin, and they are giving all the assistance to the Ukrainian, because that's part of that media thing. But in the bottom line, the worries of the United States today is the oil prices going higher and higher.
Yeah, I take this point to Adam here, and I ask you, don't you think that probably directly or indirectly that the United States is pushing this conflict between Russia and Ukraine just for the sake of gaining, let's say, making these oil prices go higher and higher? It is probably beneficial for the economy of the United States in this case.
On the contrary, I'd have to agree with Dr. Sadhi in this respect. Transportation prices in the U.S. for the average consumer are around 17% of a monthly salary. So with the U.S., with the oil barrel exceeding $130 today, that's quite significant. And it's not only in the U.S., I'll have you know. For example, in Turkey, in the past week, there have been 2 price hikes for fuel, and it's causing a significant amount of stress and consternation. Now, while there may be, for you and me, as we discussed here, yes, there are significant military developments and so on and so forth, but for the average citizen, the primary concern amid the inflation and the pressure of all this isn't especially in the context of the U.S., a war fought on a distant land, but rather what hits the wallet. I don't think that the U.S. would have instigated this. I do think that there's a narrative being presented here that a struggle against the liberal international order. To what degree that's accurate, that's up for discussion. I think Professor Sadhi would have a better insight into that. But I do not think for a moment that the U.S. welcomes this, wanted this, or in any way sort of instigated it. That said, they may be taking advantage of this in a sense, because the Western world order has never been stronger, in fact, thanks to Putin. He sort of revived a sort of feeling that has been sort of absent in international politics for some time.
All right. Now let's move to the United States, where many members of the Congress are calling on the Biden administration to help facilitate the transfer of fighter jets to Ukraine. This comes after a plea from Ukrainian President Zelensky for Western countries to send fighter aircraft into his country. Well, back to you, Adam. President Putin has said it clearly that a real war could start if warplanes are sent to Ukraine. What do you think about or what do you expect as a next step from Russia in this, if it would be applied?
Well, I think Russia wants to protect its air superiority in the region, but I don't see the offer of sending fighter jets to Ukraine as something that's going to happen in the immediate short term. It's more of a rallying commitment to the security of Ukraine in the future. And that's something obviously Russia doesn't want.
But Adam here, sorry to cut you, but we all didn't expect a war or a military intervention in Ukraine. And just overnight we found ourselves watching the Russian troops heading towards Ukraine. I mean, probably the next step might not be as far as from this.
You're not wrong. And I will say that the conflict in Ukraine, I wouldn't call it a war, a conventional war, first and foremost. It's more asymmetrical. Yes, fighter jets would definitely make a difference, but they won't arrive there in time. Now, as to Russia's response to this, again, I think it's more saber-rattling than anything. Putin is already in a war, and he's threatening of a hotter war. He's sort of reacting to his fear of fighter jets, and the U.S. is reacting to a fear of a hot war and escalation and intervention. Every side has their side to protect and preserve, you could say. But I will say that this was not much of a surprise to a lot of people who are watching this issue, whether Poland and in Ukraine, they've always been sort of hot zones that have been predicted as the next flashpoint in Europe, and we've sort of seen this. Again, the U.S. congressional aid, this is, it's welcome, I'm sure, by the Ukrainians, and it will definitely counterbalance Russia long term. But this is more of like a series of verbal commitments and supportive statements to continue the narrative in international media, frankly. It doesn't really come down to anything tangible because at the end of the day, the commander-in-chief of the United States is not willing to put boots on the ground. Sergei Lavrov has explicitly said that the only outcome to the Ukrainian issue is a demilitarization of Ukraine. So it doesn't really look like there's room for bending either way. And until then, they're sort of making things go around until
Well, Adam, sorry, but Hamoud, Adam says that he doesn't call this a war. What do you think? Do you agree with him at a time when we see the huge destruction and on the ground and the number of people fleeing from destruction?
I think Adam's view is that this is an asymmetrical war in the sense that you have a country invading another country, so it's not a fair description, or the war usually involves two sides fighting each other. In this case, there is more of an occupation, an invasion, asymmetrical, as Adams puts it. But in the end, this is a serious conflict. And the terminology may be different because what we're trying to look at is find a term that best describes the situation. The fact is, a sovereign state has been invaded by another state. The fact is that there is a superpower that has strategic interests that felt threatened and want to impose its will on the other country. We've seen this, the United States doing it in Iraq. We've seen this back in the 60s with the Cuban crisis, where the United States did not want to have its the former Soviet Union on its borders. We've seen it how the United States act in Latin America against countries that have leaning towards Russia or the Soviet Union, i.e. Venezuela, Cuba. So this is all within that strategic superpower thing. In the end, this is about world dominance. As one power wants to exercise its influence and ensuring that its national strategic interests are interested, and the other power, the United States, wants to undermine, and the European, Russian. In the end, whatever terms we use, you have a conflict that is violent, and in many ways it serves the interests of the big powers.
All right, Hamoud. Talking about world powers, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi at a news conference stated that dialogue and negotiations must be followed to resolve the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Wang Yi added that the relations between Beijing and the Kremlin is rock solid and have a very promising future. Let's have a listen.
All parties must adhere to dialogue and negotiations to resolve disputes through peaceful means. They must focus on the long-term stability of the region and establish a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism. The development of Sino-Russian relations has clear historical logic and strong internal dynamics. The friendship between the two people is rock solid, and the prospects of cooperation between the two sides are very promising, no matter how sinister the international situation is. Both China and Russia will maintain strategic determination and will continuously push forward the comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation in the new era.
Well, following the statements of Wang Yi, back to you, Adam, here. Don't you think that China is pulling itself indirectly or probably directly to a war against the USA by standing openly with Russia? What would China benefit from when it comes to this military operation?
I think that China would definitely benefit from the distraction. During the conflict in Ukraine, there were a number of incursions into Taiwanese airspace, sort of like testing the waters. And the Chinese have been known to do this, to sort of like measure response times, and sort of it's it's the equivalent of a slow burn versus a rapid move. And China's been doing this in the region for quite some time. I think it's very interesting in the statement that was made by the Chinese spokesperson, the emphasis on regional stability, which we have to say here means different things to different people. In the context of the strategic equation right now that we're looking at, with the West occupied with Russia, China has a bit more leeway in terms of what it can get away with, definitely. But there have been predictions for some time now that China and Russia have been trying to sort of like usurp the international order. That said, it's very hard to replace a hegemon, actually. You have to sort of take their role as an international law provider and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily a title that China wants. However, it goes without saying that China doesn't want a regional sphere of influence, much the same way Russia seeks to protect its borders with a revival of the Iron Curtain, so to speak. And I think we can expect more sort of like testing and belligerence on the Chinese side, specifically in the South China Sea, which are more or less established with air bases and all. I expect a strategy of anti-access area denial within the Southeast Asian waters, more or less, and containment or inverse containment, sort of denying U.S. access to the region, which is very much the strategy adopted by Russia to the north.
Right. Now we move to follow the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison chided China over what he calls its chilling silence on Russia's military operation in Ukraine, even though China had abstained from voting for or against Russia at the United Nations General Assembly with respect to the operation in Ukraine. Australia's biggest export partner had been lukewarm in its response to the conflict. Morrison urged China to intervene by condemning Russian operation in Ukraine. He called out China for refusing to call Russia's attack on Ukraine an invasion. Let's have a listen.
I would describe it more of an instinctive relationship, an opportunistic relationship, rather than a strategic one. China and Russia have got a fairly interesting history in terms of their engagement. I don't think anything has changed about that. But there does seem to be some alignment in the sort of world order that they would prefer to the one that has been in place since the end of the Second World War.
Well, back to you, Hamoud. Now China is, intervening through its statements. Are we likely in front of a whole new world order?
There will be some outcome out of this, but the issue is more complicated. When this issue is settled, the world order is a big thing to do. Certainly the vision that China and Russia have of this new world order is not the same as that of the United States and the Western power. The Western powers, and including the United States, wants a status quo. The Russians and the Chinese want a different order, one that would benefit them. And then you have a bunch of third world countries who are going from one side to another. So this will pose a serious discussion. And it could be very interesting to see how this world order emerge. China will continue to be a major economic force, will continue to look at the world from its own internal perspective. What worries China at this point is seeing, or any support to the Ukrainian will have an impact on how it views its relationship with Taiwan in particular, with Hong Kong, and with Hong Kong. And it's also, it doesn't fit its image internationally in the Chinese public eye, meaning that they don't want to get in conflict in political situation or the strategic areas militarily. What they want is that economic dominance.
Sorry, Hamoud, but we are running out of time, and probably we are going to wrap up with this. Tens of thousands of people demonstrated in cities including Buenos Aires, Boston, New York, Santiago, Vancouver, Paris, and London in support of Ukraine, demanding an end to Russia's military operation in Ukraine. Residents of the Ukrainian city of Kherson as well took to the streets this weekend to protest against the Russian military operation.
This Russian soldiers are unhumane, now killing civilians, killing them. This is unhumane. How can you let anybody in this world to kill people. They're not even standing with arms, killing them.
Belarusian. I'm originally Belarusian, but I do have a family and friends who live in Belarus, who lives in Ukraine, who lives in Russia, and I'm here for them because I do not support this war with Ukraine, and I want the Ukrainian people to understand that.
It feels very helpless. Like, I don't really know what to do to help, and I know people firsthand who are in the midst of fearing for their lives every day, and I'm not really sure. I feel paralyzed by indecision and by anxiety.
Well, that's all for today's live coverage. Very special thanks to Hamoud Salhi from the United States, in addition to Adam Ben Said, who joined us live from Turkey. That's all. Thank you so much for following us. Bye-bye.